Now, this debate comes down to a question of actors and a lot of miscommunication. Now, they talk about how there's a large double bind. There's a lot of assertions by the negative team saying that the idea of being unproductive, that being almost a method of like how we articulate what the needs are for what action is, and like how to break things down and solve in a way that is non-solved because it goes against what the situation calls for, is true and not true, because the question again comes down to actors. The way that we pose the affirmative, the way that we pose the evidence, everything else goes into the fact that we need the state to listen to itself. We think the state is the actor in question when it comes to doing nothing, not CJ and myself, because we've been positioned in this odd place where we're allowed to fantasize about having some omnipotent control to do one possible thing with the state, as like what the resolution would say, which I think is kind of fascinating. And more so we go into, on the framework line, the idea that like to implement anything with the state, we know that we are forced to use the state to do that. It's not something that we can conduct ourselves. We are rather irrelevant and not very capable of making that kind of change on such a scale that the state works with. And so if we are to engage with the state, to understand what happens, to make that work, and as the other instance, it's not about us like adopting that methodology, because our methodology is quite clear. We talk about like the importance of going into almost like that radical autonomy, which is never talked about, but more so we think the methodology when it comes to being adopted, the one that makes it work, the one that makes it actually relevant, is from the state, because the state is the perpetrator. And so our AF is in a direction that goes against what state action can be, and giving the overall capacity of what the state has to do anything, particularly when it comes to issues of gratuitous violence, or what we find is finding and scapegoating excuses such as marijuana prohibition being something that is illegal, and rather just maintaining the illegal status of it without the persecution or enforcement, saying that what the state is capable of, what the state should be doing, is exactly that, doing nothing. Like, that is the problem at hand. It's not about us not doing anything to break down what these problems are, because CJ and I are highly irrelevant, and we're in the middle of Wichita, Kansas, where we're not going to make anything productive happen from this, aside from just knowing that the actions that we take and like our just affirmed autonomous being to do that isn't going to make the distinction of what the state can do, but rather if the state goes and adopts that kind of a methodology, which is the direction of the affirmative, which is why we say that this is the reason why you should prefer the affirmative, then you find the same kind of benefits that they say that need to be spoken of not creating the same kind of structures of violence that are always perpetual. When it comes to the framework question and performance, talking about how this is all a wash, how this goes into it's irrelevant to stop state action, what we do is we say, like, yes, this performance is nothing. The whole point is saying that when we think performance alone can solve something, that trades off from actually doing what state action would be. And then we say that state action is important. We actually engage with the state in some way, because CJ and I are just going to do things. But that doesn't, like, and as much as we qualify into not adopting what the negative has been talking about this entire time, we do go into the entire articulation from the 1AC has been in the right path all along, which is like no reason to vote against it. Now, the reasons they say we should not like the 1AC specifically go into our Gevin and Kevin evidence, talking about controlling competition, which isn't actually about controlling competition, but about saying how it opens up, creates what competition is, creates what it is on the individualized level, which means that like the state doesn't have involvement, so people are free to do as they will in this one specific instance, in this one unique opportunity that for a while will be more beneficial without it, because until that perfection is recreated, which there's no articulation of what that perfection is going to be, but that perfection isn't nearly as possible when there isn't the capacity by the state to create the same kind of harm to begin with, at least in the instances of marijuana, which is very strong and makes more sense. The other links that they're going into and how we affirm the state and make the state better actually comes from not sending people to jail, which is a hard sell, to say the least. They're saying not sending people to jail increases the currency of the state because they don't have to, like, it helps the taxpayers because they don't have to pay for that incarceration. That goes against everything that their evidence is suggesting, saying that like this is what people are forced into, something worse than slavery itself, because it's this form of constant imprisonment. The perfection of that, which means it's the end of that perfected cycle. It's the end of like doing that one thing, which means that there is nothing past that that actually can be changed or adapted to through even like some dialectical process of what it is to constantly perfect that kind of oppression, because it's no longer there, because that's not happening, which they admit to, because what they're saying is that we increase that kind of thing. Now,
that itself doesn't, like, and that also doesn't help the state do the things that are wrong within the state or like function other ways. The state is distractible, the state is busy, the state is kind of annoying. But what we find is that this doesn't go into conducting like the state in a way that goes in the direction of being offensive, and more so if you look at just like how it's framed, we're saying that like negative state action being the action we take saying what the state ought to do is the one that solves in this light, and it doesn't actually go to create those harms or recreate those harms, and there's no articulation of how it does. More than that, they go into like this double bind, talking about our initial evidence saying that it's infringement upon rights and everywhere else, and that the non-reliance on the state, none of these are actually within the cards and talking about what that's supposed to do. In fact, it's all in the direction of like, the state has been imposing for too long, and the state needs to back the fuck off. And because of that, we're able to garner some kind of solvency, which is the same kind of solvency that they want, because it's the idea of doing nothing in a particular instance where it is very atrocious. So when it comes to the idea of adopting the methodology, they think it's between us and them, but it's not that. It's about between what the state does as the perpetrator and CJ and I being irrelevant, saying that we have this unique opportunity to say this, the state should just stop. And that's the round.